Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode. Today we're going to go over the top 10 weapons that Boba Fett has used. I think Boba Fett's weapons are pretty badass, so let's go over the top 10 here in today's video. Before we begin, if I could ask you to hit like, it really helps the video out, and to comment below your favorite weapon that anyone in Star Wars has ever used, and which one you would want to have. So let's begin, starting in at number 10. The ZX Miniature Flame Projector. Boba's Flamethrower is one of my personal favorites. The weapon does exactly what you'd expect it to. It casts an extremely high temperature flame at whatever target Boba has in his sights. The entire device is stored on Boba's forearm and has a range of a few meters. And to be honest, even though the flamethrower pops up in the comics a fair bit, my favorite memories are when I've absolutely failed miserably to use it in 2005's Battlefront game. In a lot of fights, Boba Fett will use the flamethrower to overwhelm an enemy that's firing from behind cover. In one particular Marvel issue, he took on a bounty hunter named Zingo. The blue-skinned villain jumped into a trench and started unloading on Fett, only revealing his hand and a bit of his head. Instead of trying to sharpshoot, Fett simply pressed a button on his forearm and filled the entire trench with fire. Number 9. MM7 Rocket Launcher. This rocket launcher is badass. Besides looking a lot like the projectile Iron Man shoots at a tank in the very first Iron Man movie, this rocket launcher has a lot of other cool things going on for it. Namely, its ability to completely penetrate armored vehicles and ships and disable them after one shot. Number 8. MM9 Mini Concussion Rocket Launcher. While we're on the topic of rocket launchers, let's talk about an upgrade to the MM7, the MM9. You've seen these weapons pop up in The Mandalorian when they've been used to take out a few stormtroopers here and there. They're kind of Boba's go-to weapon, and he often uses them to threaten people when he interrogates them. In one of my favorite scenes, he brandishes the rockets at a poor hammerhead-shaped alien when he was trying to suss out the whereabouts of Luke Skywalker. It was pretty awesome because there was really no need to brandish a rocket launcher inside of the tiny bar, but you know, Boba Fett is the type of menacing bounty hunter who really just doesn't care. And as with other rocket launchers, the actual payload of the rockets can be switched out depending on the target. There are several different homing rockets that you can have and you can use in the launcher, and some meant for penetrating armored vehicles and then exploding inside, and others meant to bust through thick fortifications. Number 7. The Z6 Jetpack. You might think that Boba Fett's jetpack is just a means of transportation or evasion, but it's actually a pretty mean weapon in its own right. Besides the nasty rockets stored inside, which we'll get to later, both Boba and his father, Jango, have used the jetpack on the offense. In the same fight with Zingo that I mentioned earlier, Boba Fett deliberately flew into the air, then using the momentum he had built with the jetpack, he swooped down towards the blue-skinned bounty hunter, using both feet to kick him square in the chest. This was the winning blow of the battle, which is pretty surprising, since Boba had both his Carbine Rifle and his Flamethrower ready for use in the fight. Number 6. The DUR-24 Wrist Laser. Besides his blaster and carbine rifle, Boba Fett also had a laser mounted on his wrist. When you try to think about how powerful it is and compare it to a standard blaster, the wrist laser is weaker in all the ways that you would expect. It's designed for convenience and for speed, so unlike the better blasters out there, it can't shoot quite as far or deliver the same stopping power. However, in close quarters, Boba Fett devastates people with his weapon. I can't count the number of times that I've been reading the comics and a random street-level criminal gives Boba a bit of a tough time or some attitude, and the bounty hunter emotionlessly unloads his wrist lasers right into their chest. Number 5. The Z6 Jetpack Rocket. Now I mentioned this one a little bit earlier, but Boba Fett's jetpack had another rocket stored at its tip. You know, if the rockets on his wrist weren't enough. Just like those other projectiles, you've also seen jetpack rockets in The Mandalorian, and they're most notable for having a larger payload of explosive forces than the wrist-mounted ones. At one point, the jetpack missile was fired at a shuttle, and in the comics, Fett has used the jetpack rocket to knock out a Wookiee. That particular fight had an interesting conclusion, which I'll share with you a little bit later in this list. Number 4. Retractable Wrist Blades. Embedded in Boba Fett's armor is a pair of small blades, which can be sprung at any time. We saw them first at the cloning facilities on Kamino, and after trading blows with Obi-Wan Kenobi, who was there investigating the creation of the clone army, Fett ended up being thrown from one of the platforms and nearly plunged into the tumultuous sea below. Luckily for Jango, he had a pair of pretty awesome wrist blades that he popped out, kind of like Batman, and dug into the metal panels of the landing pad side. These blades would also be pretty useful in future close quarters battles. Number 3. Kneepad rocket darts. I know there's been a ton of rocket-powered weapons on this list, but you can't leave these ones out. Now, I'm sure it's pretty hard to aim with your knees, but this is Boba Fett, so hey. And at least you won't be able to aim without making it obvious that you're trying to do something nefarious. And I assume that at least one of the reasons that Boba Fett chose to have rocket darts in his legs was to have another secret weapon up his sleeve. So these could come in handy at different times, especially if he were kneeling. Number 2, wrist-fired grappling hook. You might imagine a grappling hook or spear as a pretty simple weapon. It's just a rope or a cable with a sharply pointed end attached to the hip. But Boba Fett uses it in some pretty brutal ways. The time I remember most vividly, and the one that you've seen me mention a time or two, is when Fett used the grappling hook to wrap up a poor kid on Tatooine. He then proceeded to beat and eventually murder the guy in order to find out the whereabouts of Luke Skywalker. While it's not the most explosive or powerful weapon on this list, it definitely can turn any fight into a nasty affair, which is why I wanted to include it. Finally, at number 1, the EE3 Carbine Rifle. Now, this is one of the most expensive master replicas blasters. This thing is, I think it's over like $8 grand American now. It's something I really want in my collection, especially a signed one, which is even more ridiculously expensive. And it's just so beautiful. I think this weapon is really one of the coolest in Star Wars. If you know about Boba Fett, then you know that this rifle would have to appear eventually. The EE3 Carbine Rifle is one of the most feared weapons in the galaxy, and all thanks to the way Boba Fett has used it through the years. He's used the gun most often in tandem with his wrist laser, and clears out entire rooms Akimbo style. Boba Fett has used this rifle to tear through stormtroopers, Hutt thugs, and even fellow bounty hunters. There's one scene in particular that I think perfectly sums up Boba Fett's ability with the weapon. In a miniseries published by Dark Horse in the 90s, shout out to Dark Horse, I think they made the best Star Wars comics, Boba Fett was on a mission for Darth Vader on the planet of Vestar. There, he ran into a squad called the Lightning Battalion, who were having a hard time keeping a Wookiee from beating them up. Boba launched an unprimed missile from his backpack at the furry beast and knocked it out cold. But when it came to a few minutes later, Boba had had enough. He raised his EE3 carbine rifle, and without even turning his head to acknowledge the opponent, he shot the Wookiee dead. That type of apathetic killing was what made the bounty hunter so famous, and he pulled it off best with his trusty EE3 at his side. The weapon appears a bit different in the particular comic, but so does everything else, so I'm going to chalk it up to the pencilist Ian Gibson for just having a bit of fun with Boba's aesthetics. I'm very excited to see this weapon revamped once again. I hope you guys enjoyed this top 10 for Boba's weapons. If there are any that I missed or didn't put in this list, be sure to put it down in the comments or continue the conversation on the Star Wars Theory forums at starwarstheory.com, which I now have a live chat feature, so you guys can chat amongst yourselves with the community. Leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it, and I will see you all in the next episode of Star Wars Theory. Until then, remember, the Force will be with you, always.